Hello and welcome back to Equity TechCrunch's podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, January 16th. I'm Kirsten Korosec, transportation and climate editor here at TechCrunch, and I'm joined by Anthony Ha, our weekend editor, and senior reporter Sean O'Kane. Hi, you two. Anthony, you're in the city, in New York City specifically, and I'm wondering, based on some news that happened this week, if you've seen any Waymo's testing in and around New York City at all.
I don't necessarily get to every single part of the city, so maybe they're somewhere, but no, I haven't seen any myself. Now, as I understand it, there has been some news about robotaxis getting approved in New York State, but New York City is somewhat accepted from that.
Yeah, so basically, New York just in general has been very, very, very difficult for robotaxi companies to get into, in part because there's this funny state law, which makes a lot of sense for human drivers, by the way, that basically says, hey, human drivers, you have to have one hand on the steering wheel at all times. You can't go no hands.
Hmm.
But now with the innovation around robotaxis in which you wouldn't have a human driver theoretically behind a steering wheel, there is no hand to put on the steering wheel. So this week, the governor in her State of the State address did touch on how she's going to put together a proposal. It's supposed to be in the executive budget that's going to essentially allow robotaxis with some guardrails to scale commercially in the state. So they would have an exemption. They'd be able to do that. Separately, the city has been working with Waymo and has given them a permit, an exemption that allows them to test and operate in the city, not commercially though. And that permit was just extended to the end of March.
Do you have a sense of where those tests are happening?
Well, I do actually, because another one of our coworkers, which is funny because it is not in New York City, but Zach Whitaker said he's seen them in Jersey City. So I'm not really sure what's going on. If maybe there's a depot over there and then they're coming
Hmm.
somehow into New York City. I'm not really clear.
All right, well, if we have any listeners in New York City and they spot Waymo's testing, they can shoot us an email. I did also want to briefly mention another piece of news from the week before we get to the main show, which is Bandcamp said that it's basically banning AI music from the platform, which I think is, kind of standing in stark contrast to any of the big music streaming platforms, which are generally trying to experiment with AI in different ways. It was a pretty straightforward kind of no AI. We're not in favor of it. Did you guys see this? What did you think of the news?
I mean, my question here is how are they gonna detect this? It's getting so much harder to do that, even setting aside whether or not people want it. And the other question that I have is Bandcamp is often a sort of testing ground for a lot of smaller musicians. And so I hope that it doesn't kneecap some who are using some of these tools just to get, sort of their foot in the door.
Right. And it kind of reminds me of it's not the same thing. I'm going to preface that. But remember back in the day when sampling was like this hugely controversial thing in music, and there was really two sides. There were people who were experimenting. Obviously, the hip hop community was using this, but really experimenting with sampling other tracks and using that. And then there was the other half, which were the purists. This debate feels similar, although distinctly less human. But the experimental piece is kind of, to your point, Sean, like something I think I could see smaller artists kind of wanting to sample around and play around with like elements of music with AI.
It's an interesting question, and I'd be curious to see if there are good examples of where the kind of indie artists are doing that. I mean, I know that obviously there are at least a handful of artists who have used, tools like Suno to actually kind of have enormous commercial success or at least popularity. So yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think on the question of detection, I think that's a fair one. And my suspicion, I could be wrong, is that fundamentally, detection is not solvable, and you're going to have things that happen regardless, but that there's still value in kind of putting, kind of stating what your stance is and essentially just kind of establishing what the norms are.
Well, we do have to get to the rest of the show, and AI is going to come up. Big surprise there. We have deals of the week from Luminar and a Bill Gates backed startup called Type One. Then we're going to get into discussions around AI deal flow and talk about how AI is trying to change enterprise software companies. Sean, Luminar is an interesting one. They have lined up a bidder, 22 million for its LIDAR business, which, give me the history lesson here, is sort of an incredibly deep discount to the tune of tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I would say so. We're, just about, I think we've just passed 1 month since Luminar filed for bankruptcy. Luminar was one of the leading US LiDAR companies up until it filed for bankruptcy in December and was attempting to corner really the automotive market, where we see a lot of the global competition now. They're trying to supply these laser sensors that give you like a 3D picture of the world to robotics, to defense, and also automotive. Luminar was really dead set from its inception more than a decade ago of pulling this technology sort of out of the research and development and defense world and applying it to automotive. And along that path, they went public. They became very valuable. At one point, they were worth as much as like $11 billion while they were publicly traded. We've talked a little bit about how they came apart in the lead up to the bankruptcy in December. One of the big questions was what happens to the LiDAR company. Luminar had already sort of reached an agreement with a company called Quantum Computing Inc. to sell off its semiconductor business, which was like sort of a side thing that Luminar looked at as like a thing that was going to aid them in owning a bit more of the stack for its LiDAR business. But we've finally found out earlier this week that this same company, Quantum Computing Inc., is also now the what's known as a stalking horse bidder in the bankruptcy case. So it essentially gives you like a floor for the value of the assets. So, there's a decent chance that Quantum Computing Inc. walks away with those assets, but there's an auction set for next week. There's at least one other bidder that we know of. And, now it's just a matter of, is somebody going to actually try to outdo them or not? Quantum Computing Inc. is a very weird company in some ways. It was founded in 2001, originally sold inkjet cartridges. It's pivoted a number of times, including most recently a couple years ago into sort of like selling photonics for quantum computing technology, and now here they are looking to buy potentially both pieces of what's left of Luminar. So I'm very eager to see if somebody else steps in and makes another bid and what they could do with that technology. But that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what the deal is with this company, Quantum Computing. I mean, based on the name, I would assume that they do quantum computing. I don't know about you, Anthony, but that's that's what I was thinking. So selling ink cartridges seems like an odd pivot. Granted, it was, I don't know, more than 20 years ago.
Well, and it seems like this is also happening, in the background, that the former CEO also is like trying to, or at least was trying to take control of the company, is kind of criticizing this process. And now there's also this whole legal back and forth between him and Luminar, right?
I would say it's getting spicy in the bankruptcy case with Luminar. And, a big part of that is that Austin Russell, the founder of the company and the former CEO, is trying to buy, at least before they went into bankruptcy, was trying to buy the whole company. Now, as far as I've reported and as far as we know, we think he's likely to submit a bid for the LiDAR assets through this new AI Labs situation that he set up near the end of last year with former Mercedes CTO Marcus Schaefer. And we're still waiting to see that bid come in. But in the meantime, he abruptly resigned in May last year. It was a very odd situation where the news of his resignation went out like basically an hour after the company reported quarterly earnings, that earnings report that had a quote from him in it. It was a very odd situation when he resigned. And we found out over the last couple of weeks that the company is still evaluating whether or not it has any legal claims against him in relation to, what is being referred to as an ethics inquiry that contributed to his resignation. As part of that, they've been trying to get devices from him. He's turned over some company laptops and computers that he used, but they're still sort of fighting over a personal phone that they think, the company thinks has information on it that they need to evaluate, especially in light of the idea that he might be bidding on the LiDAR company. Austin Russell sort of disagrees with all this. He says that he's just trying to ensure that his personal privacy will be protected if he hands over, a digital image of his phone. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of where we stand with all that. And it's a very odd place to have landed after this decade-long story of this kind of wonderkind engineer who started a company that, soared to the top of public markets for a little while and now is in bankruptcy.
Do you have any idea? We have other deals to talk about, but do you have any idea what quantum computing would do with the LiDAR? Like, have they expressed use case?
Very little information on that front, especially because we didn't know that they were interested in the LiDAR side of the business until this week. So it's really hard to say. I mean, my big question, like these things have been developed, like I said, particularly for automotive, and with automotive in mind throughout pretty much all of Luminar's history. And so I think there's a lot of questions that may contribute to why this looks like such a bargain bin price. Although maybe somebody like Austin Russell or some sort of dark horse bidder sees it differently and will put up a bigger number.
Kirsten, you mentioned that we do have some other deals to talk about. So maybe we should get on to the next one, which is like this pretty ambitious startup called Type One Energy, which has raised some additional funding. Kirsten, you want to tell us about that?
I mean, all you really need to know, Anthony, is that fusion is so hot right now, even though a decade ago it was a total joke, or it was a butt of a lot of jokes, right? Like it was always like 10 more years, we're gonna get fusion energy. It's very difficult.
Always 10 more years.
Always 10 more years. But in this case and in others, we're seeing actually a lot more deal flow with fusion energy. And with Type 1, Tim Deschamps got a scoop. He found out that they've raised 87 million. To be clear, this is a convertible note. So this means it's basically like a short-term debt loan and, instrument that can later convert into equity. But the other piece that's really interesting is that they're working on raising a 250 million Series B at a 900 million pre-money valuation. So there are interested investors here, and they're not the only one. There's other companies out there that are making progress, and Commonwealth is one that we just wrote about last week. Investors are jumping in even though fusion is so very hard.
You mentioned how hot this sector is right now, despite, there being a lot of work left to be done, to put it mildly. I feel like we see that in the shape of this deal, right? Like the interest is so high that before even closing a round, you've got this kind of like convertible loan instrument that's being used. I think to me, just thinking about it from the structural financial side of things, it's more evidence that okay, we're in the middle of architecting this big fundraising round, but there's so much interest. Like, let's slip this extra little bit in here. It feels like a situation where, for right now, all parties are benefiting from it. Whereas usually we see some stuff like this, in a more normal environment, and maybe it's a sign of the opposite.
Right. It's interesting to think about, and I haven't seen a lot of deals that are structured in this way. And also, of course, just the dollar amounts are quite large, 250 million Series B, $87 million convertible note. And I don't know for sure exactly how to interpret that, but I could also see a kind of more cautious interpretation, or skeptical interpretation, which is that essentially they basically need some funding to keep going while they're waiting for this very large round to come together. And maybe it will, but it's not necessarily just a sign of strength and interest. You were both talking about some of the potential kind of technical hurdles that might remain. I'm curious about also just sort of, how far are they really from actually starting to build plants, essentially?
Well, first of all, just to go back a little bit about, when I was kind of joking and said fusion is so hot right now, there is one reason, a big driver why it is. It's the same reason why nuclear and especially small reactor nuclear startups are doing so well in terms of raising fund. And that's because of the huge demand for data centers and what type of energy is going to support data centers. So fusion has sort of like two approaches right now, inertial and magnetic. Type 1 is doing the magnetic. And the idea with fusion, which is interesting, is they kind of want to be like the tech provider. They don't necessarily want to operate a plant, but they are working on replacing this retired coal plant with fusion tech. And they're selling that to the Tennessee Valley Authority. So I could see sort of some of these licensing deals happening, and the timeline is still out there. Like, this is not something that's going to happen next year.
That approach that they're taking is, I think, one of the most interesting things to me here, especially when you like step back and think about all the different things that are happening to help provide more energy to power these data centers. And, we're really seeing, especially when you look at something like this, like a very full spectrum of ideas coming out right now, where, even amid some pretty serious headwinds from like the administration, battery storage, solar, that stuff's all kind of table stakes at this point in a lot of places. But we have something like this where this actually feels quite long term and maybe like speculative is I guess appropriate, but like it's an idea and a model that Type 1 Energy is seemingly doing kind of alone, whereas everyone else, I feel like, that's trying to harness energy in the near term for data centers is coming up with like other really crazy ideas, like Boom, the supersonic company, deciding to basically take some of their engines and use those like localized to power data centers, and like all the rush to pull like natural gas engines alongside a lot of these places and use the power that way. Like there's just so many ideas on the table right now. This one actually feels like a more reasonable approach in the sense that it's like very long-term thinking, and it's really trying to hedge against like a farther future than a lot of the near-term stuff we're seeing.
The TLDR here is that data centers are even hotter than fusion. And as a result, you're going to see all sorts of crazy ideas, but also a lot of like really near term, easy things to do to power these data centers, and renewables is one of them. Tim, our climate tech reporter, has written so many stories about this. And it's because permitting and the available technology is just exists today. And then on the horizon, you've got fusion and other sort of other ideas that are definitely longer term. But the important thing is that a few years ago, those ideas were on the horizon, but they weren't really getting the kind of funding that you're seeing today. Today, they're getting funding.
Well, you were also just talking about just, in general, this kind of increasing demand for data centers, and I think that's a good transition to our first big theme for this episode, which is AI deal flow. You could argue that's a theme for almost every episode we do, but we're going to focus on a couple of pillars of that and recent developments. One being health and OpenAI both buying a health startup. This comes on the heels of, announcing ChatGPT Health. Seems like Anthropic is also starting to move into that space. And yeah, I mean, I'm just curious, what have either of you thought about this?
Well, okay. So there's a lot of deal flow. To me, what is the most interesting, at least recently, I mean, maybe 6 months from now, we'll see different areas where money is going, but money is clustering right now. It seems money and products are clustering around health and voice. Makes sense. They've got to find a way to like, where are we going to use this? And also, I would say enterprise, which we're going to talk about later. It's our other theme. But on the health front, there has been like this a bunch of interesting deals. OpenAI buying this Torch. You've seen on the product front, Anthropic's Claude for healthcare, which feels like an answer. And then, okay, I don't know if this is health, but I'm going to put it under health because it just happened and I find it really interesting, which is MergeLabs, which was a Sam Altman startup, had this insane seed round. Some of our reporting confirmed some earlier reports that OpenAI wrote the single largest check for Merge at $250 million seed round at an $850 million valuation. And of course, Sam Altman also is co-founder of OpenAI. So it's a classic circular deal. And Merge Labs is a research lab. It's not a healthcare startup, but they basically say they're dedicated to bridging the biological, I'm doing air quotes, bridging biological and artificial intelligence to maximize human ability. So I feel like it's health. That's just been in the last week. So it just feels like an incredible concentration with health. I don't know what is driving it, except for it seems like maybe a natural place for AI to do work.
Certainly on the kind of biological research side, it seems like that's an area that Altman has been pretty excited about in, I don't know, in the last year or so. It seems like a lot of his appearances, a lot of his comments are often kind of focusing on that as at least one of the major areas of potential. I mean, certainly it seems like there's a lot of, commercial potential there. And at the same time, it's interesting to have a lot of these announcements are coming also as you're seeing more reports about why maybe we want to be a little cautious about how widely we adopt these kinds of things in a healthcare
Nah, we don't need to be
context.
cautious, Anthony.
I mean, the big thing, of course, which I think we've talked about in past episodes, is just there's sort of these ongoing cases, lawsuits about, how ChatGPT may or may not be contributing to people's mental health, potentially even suicide. But then there was also a kind of smaller or more isolated story, Guardian investigation about health-related queries in Google and the AI overviews and how certain searches around like blood tests and things like that were getting inaccurate responses, which Google then removed from their AI overviews. And again, these are, relatively small examples or isolated examples. But if you're a medical patient trying to figure out, what's going on in your body and deciding on whether you need to go to the doctor, whether you need to, schedule that follow-up appointment, getting inaccurate information could be pretty catastrophic.
Weirdly enough, though, the optimist in me says that the best application of some of this technology, like uh, helping sort through all these things that seem like impossible problems to solve in the healthcare world, as far as just like scheduling, collating information across different, doctors' offices and hospitals and stuff like that. Like, I actually do think there's potential there if it's rolled out carefully. The cynic in me says tech companies love to lean on health when they run out of other ideas. I mean, like, this has been the story of Apple in some ways for the last decade, where they have not really innovated in some ways, or the ways they've innovated have been like the Vision Pro, and people don't really like it and no one buys it. And so they say, well, we're going to be, health is like the next frontier, and we're really going to lean into that, and we're going to be a big part of your health journey down the road. And, I think that's the same thing that's happening here to some extent, where we are, by some of the experts in the field, like hitting a cap on what LLMs are capable of. And so the ability to say, maybe we'll cure cancer, like, is an easier way at the moment to bring in some of those investment dollars. So, like, that's the cynical side of me. But, optimistically, I hope that some of this technology gets applied in a way that makes it easier to cut out the most awful parts of the experience of interfacing with the health and care industry.
Yeah, that would be good. And just to push back a little bit, like, sure, Apple may have turned to health, but like you could say and you could argue that some of the features that they put out have been incredibly helpful. So, maybe that wasn't where they initially thought they were going, but there are some valuable products that have come out of that. I mean, to me, the downside is there are hallucination risks and there's like incredible security risks. If you can imagine, like with a hospital or a healthcare facility, let's say is running a bunch of like AI agents, every AI agent is potentially opening for security risk. So, you're talking about federal guidelines like HIPAA, lots of sensitive personal information about people's, medical history. That to me is where I have the most concerns, I would say. And I kind of wonder how many, and I don't know this. I'm just like throwing it out there into the potiverse. Maybe someone's out there and who will message us and say, well, of course, there are a ton of startups that are doing this, but startups specifically geared towards healthcare and security in the AI space, I think would be kind of an interesting idea. And I wonder if we're going to see a bunch of those.
One other thing I wanted to mention as far as the health side of things was I do want to recommend that people check out this great post by our colleague Amanda about the idea that, there are doctors who think that AI has a place in healthcare, but it's not in the form of chatbots. And she has a lot of interesting quotes in there, but it seems like the consensus is that there's definitely understandable worry about the idea of you just go into, ChatGPT or even ChatGPT Health and you're trying to get diagnosed. But I think they're also acknowledging that, hey, this is happening. And I think where maybe they see more potential is that in healthcare right now, like you said, there's just so many things that are, bad on the patient side, that are unpleasant on the doctor side, where they spend so much time dealing with paperwork that AI could potentially help with. And I don't know that I'm particularly optimistic that the ways that AI would make that more efficient are good, but at least there's a case being made there about how it could help. I think we should also talk maybe about some of these voice AI deals that we've also covered over the past week.
I know this has become totally like the health AI theme, but let's just slip this in there a little bit. There is a lot of voice stuff. I mean, on the automotive front, we've seen a lot. We saw this at CES too, but even previous CESs and throughout the past, probably I'd say year, a lot of concentration and interest on upgrading and making a voice AI assistant, which is usually the primary application of a AI assistant in a vehicle, have more natural language processing, be more robust, not be frustrating. So we're seeing that on the automotive front for sure. But just this week, Voice Run nabbed about 5.5 million to build a voice agent factory, which is an interesting idea. And then 11 Labs, the CEO said that their voice AI startup cost 330 million AAR last year. So to me, that's interesting because it's two fronts. One, companies working on voice AI are able to raise money. And on the other side of things, they're actually generating revenue, which I think, is a positive sign for companies doing voice AI. But I don't know, Sean, if you have any trepidation about that, like if there's a saturation point or something like that.
I'm always skeptical about ARR being thrown around, but especially in situations like this where voice technology is just, I don't want to say easily replaceable, but it's moving so quickly that startups that are building businesses around this are just, having to fight with like nimbler competitors who are working off of better technology stacks like that show up 6 months later. And so, 11 Labs has been around for a while and they have some size and some relationships that they can lean on, I'm sure. But that's the thing that I think about when I think about this stuff. And also, it's just like, in some ways, I'm glad to see that there's some funding still going into this idea because there's still a lot that needs to be solved because voice agents can still break down in really catastrophic ways.
I yell at voice all the time. So like to me, it's just not
Yeah.
working. So I want to continue the conversation about AI, but we're going to transition away from like more of the consumer side and really talk about enterprise. And I have an important question for both of you. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm wondering if you have tried Anthropic's new co-work tool, which is basically Claude code without the code.
I have not tried it. I would say that I think still somewhat skeptical, but more likely to use this than a lot of other consumer-ish AI tools because partly because I think I've just seen so many people rave about how Claude Code has helped them. And so there's a part of me that's like, all right, like if people are saying this is so incredible, let me actually see this for myself. The use cases being described in terms of just like helping you use different I think it's sort of like a kind of classic like agent kind of use case of like, let me just help you use these different pieces of software is not super compelling to me, but I feel like I need to try it out.
It's as is the case with a lot of these things. I have some pretty serious reservations about what it could do with privacy and the things that I have on a computer as a reporter. Like Anthony, I've been watching pretty closely how people, especially on X, a lot of the people in the tech world have been using this. There's still a big dissonance to me between like, wow, Claude Cowork organized my messy desktop. This is AGI. Like those two things next to each other are very, very funny things, funny ideas to have together. But it speaks to the greater purpose of this product and how Anthropic thinks it should and could be used. I think there's a lot of promise there of like it really being something that is more of a quote unquote co-pilot than what we've seen actually be called co-pilot or things like it in software. This is not just something that hangs out in a browser or sits on the side and is just like kind of referencing, what you're looking at or what you're working on. It really goes a layer deeper and really speaks to some of the promises we've heard from tech companies for a long time, right? Like there's an element of this that is similar to like what Samsung used to promise about its phones with Bixby, where it was like use the voice assistant to change the brightness or stuff like that, like or go into the settings of the phone. This goes, deeper because it's sort of like you can ask it even more esoteric questions like why is my battery life so bad on this laptop? And maybe it'll be able to find a way to help you with that or sort out storage issues that you're running up against. So I think there's a lot of promise for stuff like this, but the AGI term has been thrown around a lot this week, and I think that's kind of
Yeah,
funny.
fair. Well, one of the reasons why I bring it up is that I've talked to some folks who've used it who I would call more on the consumer end side of things or, very small business. But tools like this are really being viewed as a potentially existential threat to enterprise software companies, which is what we were talking about. And you've seen companies like Salesforce and others launching tons of like AI agents and stuff like that, like in hopes of, I think, combating that, which is, businesses going, "Why buy this expensive enterprise software? I'll just use this other tool." And, just this week, Salesforce launched like the next gen Slack bot, which is really meant to be an AI agent. And I think that is a direct response to things like Anthropic's announcement today to try to remain competitive.
It's interesting to think about it as, yeah, you use the phrase, existential threat. And it also reminded me of, we were having a discussion before about voice search in a past episode, and Sean was talking about the idea that one of the things that happens when you switch over to voice, or I think also a chatbot kind of interface, is that a lot of the sort of complexity kind of disappears, and you suddenly have this very narrow funnel that you get all your information through. And I'm thinking about that in an enterprise context where suddenly it's like, oh, I have this assistant who just does everything for me. And I don't see all these other pieces of software that are maybe allowing me to do that. So I'm wondering about a future where, yes, maybe, and again, I think we're still pretty far from that, but potentially a future where we have, assistants that can help us accomplish things, but that doesn't necessarily mean the assistants can do these things on their own. They still need, all these other pieces of software to actually accomplish, important business tasks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And, I will also say that there are huge security risks. Again, I'm kind of beating that drum a little bit today. And there might be an argument, at least from the enterprise software companies, that, hey, we've got the security component covered as a layered part of this product. And we actually dug into how startups are popping up to address security risks like this. So you should absolutely check out the episode before this one to hear Rebecca Ballon's interview. It's really interesting and kind of covers this topic, which is really my cue now to say that we're out of time. But Equity will be back next week, so we'll see you then. And until then, you can find Equity under the handle at EquityPod on X and Threads.